Hello, welcome to Socialist Think Tank. Today we're speaking to Aneesa Akbar, who is going to talk to us about socialism and anti-racism. Hello, Aneesa.
Hiya.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. You?
I'm absolutely fine, thanks. So, the first thing that I'd like to ask you is, what is socialism to you? What does it mean?
Well, I guess in the sort of like boring definition sort of type of looking at like the dictionary, I guess like in some ways, well, it is about looking at the economic and sort of the political landscape and how power is distributed like differently. It's so for me when I talk about socialism or talk about politics, I guess it's about understanding that like it is about a power and the relationship between people, you know, in society. So we look at society at the minute and power is concentrated in, you know, in either like big companies or like, you know, institutions, and it isn't devolved down to like, you know, working people. And I guess my question when I'm talking about socialism is how do we make sure that people have equal access in society to be able to make those changes within society that reflects like their needs and what they want to what will benefit them essentially.
So you speak about it being a sort of a way of distributing power. So what would make socialism different? How would socialism look different to what we have at the moment?
I think like looking at society now and looking at the way in which power dynamics work, there are it is a very top-down approach in terms of our society. And I guess when you look at the way in which decisions are made, it's not made in the interest of you know, normal people, or working people rather. So I think looking at sort of socialism, it would be about making sure that those at the top would be accountable to people, you know, working people, and redistributing the sort of the way in which decisions would be made. And I think one really clear example of what's happened over, well, let's talk about COVID and the way in which the media has like not challenged governments about the government about, you know, the decisions that it's made. It's all been about sort of like, well, you know, Boris is doing all right, you know, he's just had a kid, he's going to change his ways, he's become a father for the seventh or eighth or however many times it is, and suddenly that's going to make a difference to the way in which his relationship with the public and the decisions that are going to be made. And it's sort of like shuts people out who are questioning like why there wasn't enough PPE, or you know, the people that were key workers who were, you know, being forced into being in unsafe conditions, and trying to silence them. And if we had a different sort of society where power was actually, you know, distributed equally, and it wasn't just in those people that wanted to make profits off our backs, then actually like we would be listening to those key workers who, you know, have risked their lives essentially like during this COVID 19 pandemic, or global pandemic. So I think that would be the difference, I guess, in terms of a socialist society. We wouldn't be just allowing people to die for the sake of profit.
Ah, that's a pretty big statement there, like allowing people to die for the sake of profit. And I suppose a lot of people feel that way, don't they? That the government are making decisions from on high. And I think one of the things that's important about socialism is it thinks about individuals as being individually important humans. Whereas I think at the moment we've got this top-down structure where people are, you know, people just become numbers from that height, if you will. So, well, you know, they put a target of 20,000 people to die being a good outcome for COVID and things. And you think 20,000 people losing their lives, that's 20,000 tragedies, you know, and it's such a strange way of thinking from that height that actually you're just a number. And I think that's an important thing about socialism, that we do kind of think that everyone in that system is important. Are you involved at all in any of the sort of trade unions or anything, or any grassroots organisations?
Yeah, so we've been involved. I'm quite involved in Hull and District Trades Council, which has been it's just been really re-energized over the last like 5 years, I guess. And we've seen, you know, young people sort of come in and get involved with the conversation on trade unions, and we've put on events with we've had this event called Engage for Change, where we've done like a music festival and tried to get young people involved in having the conversation about trade unions, because I think that's a really important part of looking at workers' power, or like collective power, and showing people how important that is, within workplaces, and showing that solidarity. And I guess for people of, I'm 28, and I think the language of like trade unions has been lost amongst people of my age group and younger. Remember working in a call center, and the sort of the conditions were horrendous, like, but you talk to people about, well, actually, should we join a trade union? And the barrier wasn't just like, oh, well, I don't like trade unions. The barrier was like, what is a trade union? So this whole language, this whole generation has sort of like lost what it means to sort of work collectively, I guess, within those organized sort of organizations.
I think the CWU have been working very hard on those areas, and I think they've actually been quite a dynamic trade union, and quite visible and quite inclusive. And I think that deserves a lot of praise, and that's possibly a way to get over that. And the idea that working together with people who are in your workplace is actually a positive thing. I was wondering, at what stage in your life did you think to yourself, I'm a socialist, or have you not thought about that ever? Or is there a moment, or is this just something that's always been in you?
I don't know. I guess like, I think when I was growing up, I was just looking at the world, and I was just getting so mad about how people could justify injustices. And I remember sort of being quite political at the age of 14, but I think growing up under New Labour like sort of forces you into being political, and especially as a person of colour, I think like it wasn't a great time to sort of be growing up. And I think people forget that alongside the really good things, and the such as minimum wage or Sure Start, or looking at sort of like EMA and like access to education, there were so many other things that like allowed people to be scapegoated, and Muslim communities and Black communities were part of like the package of us getting like sort of really minimal wins. And so I started like looking at sort of where I grew up, which was Manchester, and there was already quite like a lot of problems with like homelessness, and like looking at sort of drug abuses, like within the city centre, and outside of that. And I guess like I just wanted to fix things, and I just didn't want to like live in a society that thought that was okay, and it just made me really angry. So but I think you move from that anger, I guess. Like I think it's really good to be angry in politics, and I think a lot of times we're told not to be angry. I think it's good to be angry in politics because it means that you care. But I think one of the best things that somebody ever taught me was actually you have to like use that anger and like create some like positive change with it. You can't just be like bashing your keyboard on Facebook. I'm not even sure whether Facebook was around, like I think it was when I was 14, but so it's got to move beyond sort of like being able to just be angry and just rant about things. There's got to be a vehicle of like actually organizing and changing. And I was really lucky because my history teacher at GCSE, she taught us about the working class history of Manchester, and she developed a map for us, which was basically like a radical route of like all the major sort of things that had happened in Manchester, and about working class people, where they'd like actually made significant like moments in history, such as like the Peterloo massacre and stuff like that. And so like I remember like getting this map and just like looking at the city that I'd grown up in, and just thinking like, this is just incredible. Like you're like, I'm in a city where like people were pushing for working class people to be like heard and to be representative and like their collective power. And actually like it just showed like that actually things could be done. Do you know what I mean? Like things could change and things do move, and the only reason things do change is because we all work together. Like power will concede nothing to us. Like we have to work collectively to make those changes that we want to see in society. And yeah, so I guess like my history teacher was just probably one of the gave a name to what I was already thinking, like in terms of what was going on. I was just mad at the world, and I was like all over the place. Like I was just like, oh yeah, like we need proportional representation to like something like equally like not ridiculous. Like I'm not saying proportional representation is ridiculous, but like in terms of like looking at society as a whole and like how do we actually make those changes? Like I think I guess like I'm thankful to Miss Cook.
I was going to ask you who the teacher was, because she sounds amazing. And I'd like to see that map, to be honest, because I lived in Manchester for a time at university, so I know about like the TUC being formed there, and I've been to conferences in Manchester, and it's always a really nice place historically for people who are into trade unionism and working class movements. So what you've described there is it's so familiar to me, because every time I speak to someone who's a really good trade unionist or a really strong socialist with strong ideas, it's almost like this thing of, well, why do you do it? And people do say, well, it comes down to, I can't help it. You know, if you boil it down, I just can't help it. It's who I am. I don't like injustice. And it's really nice to hear that from so many people. And you always make the best trade unionists, but doesn't always work out that well for the individual, because you're always about the collective, and that individual can sometimes be fall victim to to their own compassion, let's say. But speaking of injustice, you've done a lot of anti-racism work, haven't you? And how does that fit in with your socialism? To be a socialist, do you think it's necessary to be anti-racist?
I think so. I think looking at society, I think one of the big things about so looking at Black Lives Matter at the minute in terms of institutional racism, I think sometimes like people just want to like compartmentalize everything that's going on. I think institutional racism is a product of a society that is a class-based society. Like it's linked to that. And I think looking at institutional racism and what benefits people get from that, like if they see a divided class, if they see like people that they divide each other upon being white and being a person of color, then actually like that only helps those that want to sort of exploit us in society. So for me, like, I've been doing a lot of work I did some work in Manchester, but I've also done a lot of stuff in the city of Hull, where I'm currently a councillor. And, we've seen the way in which austerity has sort of impacted working class communities, but also the way in which the narrative from the Tories has allowed for BAME communities to be attacked continuously by this government, and also the way in which that's fed into making people think that it's BAME communities, like they're trying to steal your jobs or your houses, like rather than looking at the system that says that a system that can provide for all, that doesn't, because it doesn't want to. So going looking at some of the stuff that's that I've been doing in the city. So I've come across taxi drivers that have been facing a lot of racist abuse, and a lot of them in Hull and do come from BAME backgrounds. And I think one of the things that I thought was really important to look at was to sort of set this in the context of class, and make sure that I got the trade unions involved, which we're having conversations with at the minute, because if your employers aren't looking out for this, if the police aren't looking out for this, and if the council aren't really doing anything about it, then we need to show people that together, they might be able to complain individually about their experiences, but as a collective force about talking about their safety at work and relating it back to, relating it back to that, as well as educating people about the power of trade unions and collectivism, and bringing that language back into our communities, I think is really important. And also it stops this reliance on essentially gatekeepers that we have in politics, and who want to take all the glory for themselves in terms of look what I've done, look, I fixed it. Actually that power I think people in positions of power should be using that to give power back. And so for me, like as a local councillor, like I get a lot of like these issues, but I think part of my role is to make sure that like working class communities and like communities around me know that they have power as well, and know that actually they have to tell me off as well. Like that's part of like the relationship. Do you know what I mean? And I think for too long we've lived in like a sort of political sort of arena where actually people just want to they just want to take all the glory for like actually what communities can achieve when they work collectively together.
I think what you say around like working class people is very, very interesting. I often find, so I've been on a lot of anti-racist demos, and I sometimes look over at the other side, and because I would always be on the side of the anti-racists, of course, but I look at the other side and I sometimes think, you probably suffer from almost identical problems. The only difference is you don't have the added issue of skin color coming into it, or you know, or perceptions around belief coming into it. You know, so really, should those people be a lot more united? And is there a way to do that, do you think? It's a hard question, by the way.
I think there is, and I think part of what we need to be doing is to be explaining what is going on in society better. And I think part of the problem is that, you know, so what we can see, what I think part of the frustration is, I think there are elements of, you know, the working class community, like you said, like you are just like, well, why are we having this conversation? Because the media is saying to us, like, actually, you know, it's about ridiculous things, like such as, oh, we're going to like ban like TV programs, or we're going to ban like you from saying blackboard, or like, you know, these ridiculous sort of like things about what people are actually asking for. And I think when you actually break it down for people and say, well, look, like these are the figures, like, you know, Black people are dying like from police brutality, and this is what, you know, parents, and this is what, like, you know, people like families, friends don't want to be having the conversation of, is like, how do you like go out and make sure that like you're not going to die at the hands of police brutality, alongside the other multitude of things that are going on. And it's not just you know, like performative sort of gestures of like, well, we're gonna ban like what's that guy, the Little Britain guy or whatever, like, you know, take his programs off thingy. I mean, it wasn't funny, like, to begin with. Little Britain wasn't funny, and I know that might be unpopular with people, but like but like aside from like, you know, the sort of blacking up and stuff, it just wasn't funny. But yeah, anyway, but I think it's about, you know, being kind and being compassionate to each other in our conversations, and but also just like drawing a line, like where a line needs to be drawn. Like I often get, when I challenge you know, racism, say within the party, and in the Labour Party, like the conversation has sometimes been, well, you know, you've just got to excuse them, like it's working class language, and like that's just how people speak. And I think there's a difference between, like, you know, somebody, you know, misusing, sort of like not fully grasping the picture, to somebody being racist, and I think it's really patronizing, like when people of color say to you that like this is the conversation that they're having, that they are experiencing racism. And as a local councillor, like I can say, like hand on heart, like I really love like the ward that I represent. It's really working class, overwhelmingly voted to leave. But you know, the conversations that I've had with people in my ward, like you know, some people that are in their 80s, like, and they've just said to me, Aneesa, I don't understand like why people are experiencing racism. Like we're all God's children. And I think people do understand it. I think people do get it. But I think it actually, like, where is the problem coming from? And again, I think it's like with media, with politicians who don't want to have the conversation about institutional racism, because it benefits them, like in terms of dividing us. But I think on a like for normal people or working people, like I think they get that conversation.
I find what you say really interesting there. Sometimes I think divides are put up between us that aren't actually there. And you talk about people using certain language and that being and that being held against them almost, rather than, so sometimes people will absolutely scream at someone and say, oh, you got that word wrong. Well, actually, you and I know that word doesn't, if that person doesn't have any intent behind that word, then you can simply say, oh, that word's a little bit wrong. Can we use a different one? And they might go, oh, I'm sorry, and feel all embarrassed. And and it really doesn't need to be framed the way it is. And I also, last summer, when Boris Johnson prorogued Parliament, we organised a pro-democracy rally, and it wasn't pro-Remain and it wasn't pro-Leave. It was simply pro-democracy. We're saying we don't like the fact that he's shutting down our democracy. We sneaky one. Whoever organised it didn't tell the police, and right-wing demonstrators came, pro-Leave demonstrators came, and you would have thought that all hell would have broken loose. But actually, when we said, come over here, like I was stood on a chair somewhere, I was like, oh, come on, get involved in the conversation. So everyone just gathered round. No one knew which side anyone was on, which side anyone was on. And actually, they were extremely confused that we weren't just saying, overturn the referendum. That's why they were there. They were there to tell us not to overturn the referendum. Like, we don't intend to. And I've never seen so little trouble and so little nastiness at something like that. And I think sometimes the barriers that are put between us, if there was a line of police between us, what would have happened there? So speaking, I was interested in what you were saying about TV programs, and I don't want to dwell on this because that's not what people are after. But have you ever seen It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia?
I've only watched a couple of episodes. I've not watched loads.
So a couple of them have gone where they used blackface.
Okay.
But they were very clearly saying it's absolutely wrong. Like, they're supposed to be absolutely terrible people. So do you sometimes feel that people's reactions to taking those kind of programs off air cause more problems than they should?
Yeah, I mean, like, I just think it's like a distraction in terms of like the debate. And I think, so like we look at like sort of like the whole statues discussion as well. And actually what people want to be talking about is like history as a whole, and looking at within its context, but also like recognizing that stuff was bad. And I think, nobody's trying to erase history. And, from a really cynical point of view, I think sometimes it can feel as though it's about delegitimizing like what is actually being said, or it's well-meaning people who don't actually speak to like black people about like what it is that they actually want, and just assume that this is something that like will make things better. So I think in terms of like this whole conversation about like books or like TV programs or whatever it is, I think there just needs to be a listening exercise that goes on, and actually just listen to each other about, well, what is the issue, what is the problem of that, and then how do we move forward? Because I just think I've just been getting really frustrated with like the whole sort of like, we're gonna take this TV program off or whatever, when you're still platforming people like have been platforming people like Katie Hopkins or like David Starkey or whatever. Like, actually it just rings a bit like hollow. And this whole idea recently of where the BBC is not going to allow people to have like Black Lives Matter badges on. Well, actually, like, did you not, like, you're journalists, how did you not know what Black Lives Matter was actually about? And you're sort of saying it's been hijacked now, but actually their demands were like really clear in terms of what they wanted. So how can you go from, well, everyone's wearing a badge, to no one can wear a badge now because you didn't actually look into what Black Lives Matter was about, which is essentially what they're saying, right? Like, they're journalists saying that they didn't actually read into what Black Lives Matter was about. So I just think it's just a whole sort of like distraction, like in the conversation. And I think we've just got to recognize that Black people just don't want to be killed in the streets, alongside like the whole issue of like institutional racism.
Would you say that a white working class community, which in the area that I live, it's a large majority of white working class people, would you say they have more in common with Boris Johnson, or would they have more in common with a kind of a working class community from another area of the country that isn't so white?
I mean, I think that's your easiest question that you've given me. Like, so definitely like working class communities, like, in terms of like, yeah, like the diversity of our class is brilliant. And I think we just need to recognize just how how beautiful it is, like when we're all woven in together, rather than, you know, Boris Johnson, he hates all of us, doesn't he? He hates all of us, really.
I was speaking to Alan Margin from the Durham Miners Association, and they've, for years and years, they've had they've seen it that way, that they've got more in common with miners in Colombia or South Africa than they do with the people who are the ruling elite in this country. But we seem to have lost that knowledge somehow, you know, from our working class communities. How do we convince people who are working class, or, you know, some people like to just say working people, but I actually try and say working class, because there's a lot of working class people who end up not being working people because they might be disabled and able to work, or they might lose the job unfairly, or, you know, they might not just be able to find work. So I actually do prefer to refer to working class people. But how can we convince that workers and working class people are better united regardless, and that actually they shouldn't be fighting against one another?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like, I have used like working people within like this core context, but like normally I would use working class people, and you're absolutely right to like sort of pick up on that as well. So I just wanted to sort of clarify that, because I think that is really important, and you don't, yeah. Anyway, so I think in terms of like uniting people, I think one of the things that we need to recognize is that Boris Johnson and Trump, like, they've been able to do this like amazing thing where they've like characterized themselves as like anti-establishment figures whilst being like wholly part of the establishment. And one of the reasons why I think that Brexit was such a major conversation within this country, and why I think working class people on a whole did vote for leave, was because of this lack of power that we perceive in our lives. And I think, you know, a lot of, you know, people that I've spoken to who, you know, really dismissive of leave, you know, scoff at the idea that people would vote on the issues of sovereignty. And actually, whether you believe like whether we're a sovereign nation or not, or however you see the EU sort of interrelating with that, I think like actually, like for a lot of people, there was such a lack of power, like in people's lives, you know, with their connection with their MPs, to their councillors, and all that sort of jazz. Like actually, you know, they like, you know, I think that was sort of like a reaction to like, you know, people not listening. And I think if we're really going to sort of like change those sorts of attitudes, then I think one of the places that we do need to go is that we need people to be involved within local council structures, and to become councillors, and, you know, to be involved in their trade unions as well. But I think I look at sort of like, you know, councillors or councils across the country, and there's amazing work that's being done to be able to engage communities better. And actually, you know, we're closer, you know, than MPs to being able to like, you know, build community links and to build like strength within communities, and also show them like where power is, because a lot of people don't understand that, like, the difference between what local councils actually do and like what their role is, and what like government actually does, and what MPs' roles are. Because, you know, and I think it's sort of done on purpose, like where we're not educated on how these institutions operate and work with each other, to shut working class people, I guess, out from those conversations, because they don't want them to know how these institutions work. And that sounds sort of like as though it's deliberate, and as though it's like sort of like, you know, like a really cynical attempt. But I think, you know, looking back at civics like sort of classes, like in terms of like this is how like the country works, they were absolutely rubbish. Like, I went to, you know, a Wally Range High School, and like in a really working class part of Manchester, and the sort of the you know, we were being taught about how our governments and institutions operated, and it was just all really surface level, like all really like just incredibly basic about, and also really individualistic as well, about like, you know, this, you can vote. And it's like, yeah, but what am I voting for? Like, what does that vote actually mean? Like, what does my member of parliament do, or what does my local councillor do? So yeah, so I think part of how we move forward is to actually get, you know, socialist or left-wing councillors elected, so that they can have those conversations and have their literature talking about, you know, some of the collective work that we're doing, and also like to be able to push forward the ideas of trade unions. Like, I've been on many door knocks where, you know, people have complained about like their jobs or whatever, and I've managed to sort of like convince them to join a trade union, because even though it'd be like trying to get out votes with the Labour Party, the trade union and the Labour Party, they are one and the same, and they should be seen as one and the same. So that shouldn't be a difficult conversation, you know, for Labour Party members to be having on the doorstep. But I think that's something that we need to do. And I think talking about, you know, getting socialists into local councils and having those conversations in that way should be an important part of that.
It's interesting that you mentioned about things being really confusing and difficult to understand and things, and I think a lot of the time very boring. So, you know, and that goes into like local political party meetings, like, you know, branch meetings and CLP meetings can be really, really boring at times. And we do deal with these business ideas, which really don't excite people. When I was little, I went on the poll tax marches, and the idea of going on those and then seeing what came out of that, when you saw that instead of the poll tax, it was then changed to the council tax, which people, and I think that was a deliberate thing. I think that was deliberately named council tax to blame local councils for national cuts. I think it's been a very, very long-term goal. And locally where I am, we lost 3 seats, including mine, for the Labour Party. And I think part of that was a lot of people blame the local council for the cuts rather than the national government. I don't think there's enough understanding there. So I don't know, like, what we should do about that with regards to political education. Should that be taught in schools, do you think, or should that be taught elsewhere?
I think the Labour Party needs to do better in terms of explaining that. I mean, you know, with Jeremy Corbyn, like he managed to sort of like shift the conversation of austerity, and I think one of the things that we've fallen into the trap in recently with COVID is that we've just sort of agreed with the government and we didn't learn the mistakes of like, actually, like, we need to be calling them out, like, and we need to be sort of shifting the blame. And it's been really clear from what the government has been doing in terms of having the confused messaging, pushing sort of like local lockdowns onto, you know, local councils and stuff, or like local localities, and also the conversation that they've been having in terms of like their own sort of like staff or ministers like sort of breaking lockdown, but then blaming individuals, like, you know, for the inconsistency of message. And I think that has been really cleverly done by the Tories. And I think when we come out of this, what will happen is that they will blame local councils for not for just having followed their advice, because they've only labelled it as advice. They've not labelled it as like, you know, you need to act upon this in a certain way. So they will blame local councils for not looking at their different localities and how that would affect, you know, each area differently. They'll blame the police for not enforcing the unenforceable, and they'll blame individuals for being selfish when actually they didn't tell people how to do stuff. So I don't know what we can do, because like actually that, you know, the media sort of been backing them up on that, the Tories have been backing them up on that, and I guess the party nationally like has sort of semi been backing them up on, like, you know, sort of individual sort of cases. And I think part of our problem on the left is I think we do good memes between each other, like, which are really funny, but I think the right is so much better at being able to get their message out on like social media. And I think one of the things that we probably need to come out from lockdown is being able to convey our message better, like online, and having those conversations like better online. But yeah, I guess I'm semi-hopeful in terms of like, you know, once we, you know, the mutual aid things have been just like a brilliant way of showing collectivism and like, you know, showing like how people are willing to work together. But I think it's going to be a really difficult conversation. We'll just have to see after, like, when we're allowed to like meet people properly and like face to face, just how much of this was just people just ranting on Facebook, or whether it is just like, well, we're having another battle to fight, really.
So, hopes for the future then. So you've spoken there about COVID mutual aid groups, and I know a lot of socialists have been involved in mutual aid groups, and in fact they've really come to the fore. And I think some of the people who are involved in mutual aid groups as well are probably doing it for the exact same reasons that all the socialists are doing it, which would make me think that they probably unknowingly are socialist because they just believe in kindness and helping one another in community. How do we build on that feeling of goodwill and that helpfulness and that? So I suppose it's a way of thinking the best of people and trying to do what's best for people. Do you have any ideas around how we would do that?
Yeah, I think just like sort of looking at like the sort of like the mutual aid groups has just been, you know, phenomenal in terms of the way in which, you know, where there's been such a lack of hope in terms of like people wanting to help each other. It's been really inspirational. I think like part of the conversation has got to be like, you know, like talking to your neighbours. Like, you know, I've really got to know my neighbours pretty well, probably because I'm not out like campaigning all the time. Like, so I've actually been able to like be in the house, like, and actually get to know my neighbours. But I think, you know, building those community links and like, you know, looking at like our community centres, like looking at our hubs and like seeing how do we, you know, bring people in together, you know, so like just looking at like those spaces, I guess, and just finding like different ways. I think one of the things that I've been looking at recently with other people in the city has been, you know, we've been having a really big conversation about like the private rented sector, and so we've managed to like pull like people from different areas and looked at a whole specific renters union, so that we're not going to, you know, like charge people to like be involved in it, but actually like the private rented sector has just been taking I don't even know how a polite way to put it, but like basically like it's not been great to people, so that needs to be challenged, but giving people like spaces and areas to sort of organise and not. And like, you know, I love the Labour Party, I'm proud to be a member, but recognising that the Labour Party isn't the only place in which we can achieve, you know, good things for our community. Like, you know, being a member of the Labour Party is informed from like, you know, my socialist ideals and like what I would like to, you know, I want a Labour government, as, you know, and I do believe that is the best vehicle for change. But I also recognise that actually, you know, as mentioned earlier in the conversation, that building community power and building community, like, you know, sort of like knowledge about like how to organise and how to keep people accountable is also really important to keep the Labour Party honest in terms of delivering for working class people.
I think that really brings us full circle, doesn't it? Because, you know, we started off at the beginning talking about community and, you know, and being grassroots and building up and having people whose lives are affected by these decisions, they're playing a part in those decisions, and then like pushing that upwards rather than everything coming down from the top. And I think really you've summed up there what we should be doing as socialists. So thank you so much for talking to me today. I really appreciate it, and thank you for all the work you do in your community, because I think we've needed it, haven't we?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. It's actually been it's just been a really nice conversation to have, actually, like, and hopefully we can speak again soon.
We keep the red